I want to give a big thank you to all my patrons, and I'll be doing a Kingsguard roll call after today's video. Welcome back to the Fantasy Network, everyone. My name is, of course, Jimmy Nuts, and today we're going to be doing a no-spoiler review of The Shadow of What Was Lost by James Islington. It's not Islington, it's Islington. I've triple-checked this. I better be right, or I'll be embarrassed. Great cover on this book, even though I don't think any of these characters actually exist in the narrative, which is just a bit weird, but definitely cool covers through the whole trilogy. And this does kick off one of the more divisive modern fantasy series or trilogies out there.
Oh, isn't this just the Wheel of Time ripoff?
Well, that is what some people claim, and there are definitely some inspirations here from the Wheel of Time, and I think that this is like the most popular label that gets placed on The Shadow of What Was Lost, but I also see many other inspirations in this work. Without a doubt, Wheel of Time, but also things prior to Wheel of Time, things that were at the same time as the Wheel of Time. And believe it or not, Bobby B, fantasy did exist before 1990.
Not for me, it didn't.
And just based on the size of this thing, you can tell that this is aiming to achieve what epic fantasy of a time before did accomplish and feel epic and have that scope. And while I do think the plot does remind me of some of my favorites, this modern work fails to perform outside of its very wild and fast-paced plot. The Shadow of What Was Lost by James Islington is sensational fantasy for better or for worse. Sensational can be negative, it can be positive, it just depends on how you say it, and whenever you throw that upon a work, I mean it in both of those ways, because there are times where sensational moments and the twists and turns of this had my jaw almost dropping, and I wanted to talk about it with other people and say, wow, this is something else. But also, when it comes to sensational, there were times where things felt a little bit over-dramatized, and unfortunately it was missing the depth of other great sensational fantasy works even. For me, the sensational plot sacrificed writing style, compelling deep characters, and any subcontext that could be maybe taken and explored and figure out exactly what the author's saying with, but unfortunately there's just none of that value here for me. So what is The Shadow of What Was Lost about? What is Licanius Trilogy all about? Well, there were some wars many years ago, like every epic fantasy it feels like, and there was an oppressive regime that was ruling with magical powers that unfortunately went a little too far. And then once they went too far, they were overthrown by the people. And of course, there is an existence of something in the north that is threatening everyone that has been forgotten and people not believe in it anymore. You know, this is classic stuff. And I'm here for most of that. I like pretty much everything that was laid out here in book one as far as what we're familiar with and the tropes of fantasy. These ones work for me. The Augurs were the ruling class of a time just a little bit ago before this takes place, and they were very godlike. In fact, they could even see into the future at times. They were able to predict things. They can tell when people lied. Of various amounts of magical talents that were really cool. However, things did begin to, unfortunately, go bad, and they were starting to get some of their predictions right. They weren't as accurate anymore, and as they were trying to buy some time to figure out what in the world was going on with their power, this is where they became oppressive and started making a lot of bad decisions. And to keep the people oppressed, keep the information restricted so that they could still be trusted or want to be trusted, right, with the information that they're having that is inaccurate, trying to bide some time. And this is what eventually leads to the major conflict that happened in the past. The gifted are the people who served underneath of the Augurs, who had, the gift, the talent, the magic as well, but weren't quite to the level of the Augurs. The Augurs were one step above that. And after the rebellion, the Augurs were no more. They were completely gone, or so people think. And then you have the gifted that are left over. So they are restricted by the four tenets, which is an agreement between the people and the gifted of how they can actually interact with magic. They can't harm people. So it's like, it's like a law almost against them. And it's written in a way that it can be enforced. And if you break that, you will become a shadow. So shadows are people who break the four tenets and the agreement between the gifted and the people. And also, if you do not pass the trials to become a gifted, to say that you can handle your magic appropriately or you have enough of it, it destroys any trace of the essence or the gift in you, and then you're just covered with these nasty, black, spidery marks all over your body, and you could tell that this would be something that would call you out in society. You would obviously be recognized and ridiculed. So we already set up the power structure, and now that the Augurs have been overthrown, the gifted are not just restricted, but definitely being treated very poorly for people who are generations removed, and then the shadows are even beneath that. So there's a lot of cool stuff that that could be explored with class and power structures and all of that. There are a lot of characters in the Shadow of What Was Lost, and some of the main ones include Caden, Asha, Weir, and then really what's the main character for me in book 1 is Davian. Now, like I said, a ton of other named characters in here, and I'll let you figure those out if you decide to pick this up. But talking about Davian, Davian opens up in this book. He is one of the gifted, or trying to be. He's going to be going through his trials and has a nasty, vicious scar from a beatdown for possibly being one of the gifted a while back. So he's a good lens of what it means to be gifted in the current age here in Licanius. And he is very much struggling with the essence and the magic and getting ready for this trial. And he's very, very nervous. And he also has a secret, and that is the fact that he can actually tell when people are lying, just like the augurs used to generations ago. And this is something that he must keep secret because augurs are banned, killed, eradicated. So a teenage boy with a trial coming up with a scar who has magical abilities and might just be the chosen one. Yeah, it sounds like Fantasy 101, does it not? I think you can probably figure out all of the inspirations that went into this book, at least for Davian's character. And while we're kind of getting introduced to the world in The Shadow Was Lost through Davian and through a gifted's POV, we meet all of his friends and all that other stuff, but there's also that existential threat from the north that I talked about earlier, and there was this essence wall built by the augurs thousands of years ago, and of course, you guessed it, it's fantasy, the wall's weakening. And that is no good for the people of this world. I dig this. This is one of my favorite fantasy tropes. It's in Shadowmarch. It actually reminded me a lot of Shadowmarch because I had just read Shadowmarch right before I started this by Shadowmarch by Tad Williams, that is. And obviously A Song of Ice and Fire, Wheel of Time, many, many other stories. But this is one of the fantasy tropes that I am not sick of. But if you are, you may not like it here. So there's a very cool world set up here and stuff that feels familiar, but also, a little bit fresh. But the characters are a little more than stick figures for me. And it just feels like what you see is what you get. And there's not any deeper subcontext that you can dive into here with these characters. They just kind of are. There's no deeper meaning to the themes that could be explored with all of the structure that I've set up. You can see that there is a framework here to work with and to maybe get across a really awesome message, or just play with some of the tropes that we have in the fantasy and subvert them or change them or twist them. And unfortunately, the characters that are in the story, they don't ever get around to doing that. Now, there is a bit of time travel here. I love time travel, which is just another thing we can throw into like what I would like about this book. But if you don't like time travel, this series is probably not going to be one that you're going to enjoy. Figuring out a lot of the timelines and stuff is a lot of fun. I think he does that piece of this very, very well. And I also do think that the plot is great. But there are times where this does feel a bit like formulaic fantasy. Chapters are beginning where people are waking for the day and the sun shining on their eyes, and then at the end of the chapter everything goes dark, or the character knows no more, the same old song and dance. With all that said, I'm in on this plot. I was enamored with the mystery and I needed to know what was happening next. Like, it goes down so easy because the writing style is not something that is going to blow your mind. It is very, very plain. That is one of the things that I look for in great fantasy, is a distinct writing style. It doesn't have to be the most flowery ever, but there's nothing that you would separate James Islington's work from like a Fonda Lee or whoever else. If you put a paragraph from this book up in a lineup and removed all of the in-world references, I would never know that he had written this. Some of you are going to like that. I happen to want just a little bit more than that. I like a little bit of stylized writing. I said the same thing in my Jade City review, but I have to reiterate it here because this is very plain writing. But it does make it go down easy, and you get to find out what happens next. And you're trying to piece together this time travel puzzle, timelines, mysterious personalities and names. It is fun. This is a blast to go through, and I like the plot a lot. And they're not the worst characters ever written. My frustration with this book stems from the fact that a lot of the tension that could be explored and dove into, when it not only comes to personal conflicts in the characters, but, even society at large, it's all handled with oven mitts, and it's never delved into really at all. There are some opportunities here to go over themes such as like power, class, xenophobia, identity within a society, and none of those, they're just brushed over. They're just brushed over, unfortunately, which is a shame because there's a lot of really good setup here. I think you can read this book, and some of you are going to like this, but this is something that bothered me, is you could read this entire book without ever having to consider what it is trying to say. Do you know what I mean? It does not engage with its conflicts that it creates. at a personal level at all. For example, a character could be super brash and arrogant, causing some tension within a group or in a friendship, and you're like, oh, now that could be interesting. Like, how is that going to shake out? And then just a few chapters later, it all gets ironed out between the characters because they say, hey, it was a misunderstanding, or hey, you know what? I was being a jerk. I'm sorry, which sometimes can be refreshing. Not everything has to be this big drama, but it seemed to happen time and time again, and none of the resolution to the conflicts were all that interesting, and it just felt a little juvenile, and it felt a little lame to me, to be honest. And I hate to use such brash terms, but I had so much hope for this going in. And it's also very concerning when you have in my opinion, not a super deep work. Whenever you're so narrative focused and so plot focused, if you're not resolving conflicts in an interesting way, that worries me about the end of the story, right? Because whenever something is fast plot driven, it needs to have the ending. The ending, I think, then gets weighed even heavier, which I'm someone who can forgive an ending. I'm much more about beginnings most of the time. But you're putting yourself into a bit of a box here. And for full disclosure, I ended up reading book 2. Okay, so I've actually read book 2 of this, and I'm a little bit of ways in on book 3. And the reason why I decided to go ahead and do this review of book 1, because I was going to wait till the whole trilogy was over, is that to this point, which is like 10 chapters into book 3, I feel the exact same way about book 2 and so far book 3. So I said, why not go ahead and put out a review for The Shadow of What Was Lost, because it's probably going to end up being my opinion about the trilogy as a whole. So if you don't see any more Licanius videos here on the channel, you can just safely assure yourself that this is the experience that I have with the whole trilogy. If book 3 does surprise me in one way or another, if it goes totally south or totally, awesome, then I will make another video. But if you don't see it, this is pretty much my opinion on the trilogy as it stands. So it is a very mixed experience. Could this be the one time in fantasy where we need more books? So often we say, oh, they would have cut out this, they could have made it better. We hear about Wheel of Time all the time. If you cut out some of the books, oh, it could have been perfect. Is this one of those circumstances where maybe it should have been a longer series? I happen to think so. And I would love to hear from people who have read this and even finished a trilogy if you feel that way. Because I do think that there's a framework here, like I said, to do something better. Maybe not better is the word, but deeper and a more meaningful piece of work in the fantasy genre. But I am also hesitant to say that because I'm not convinced that James Islington's writing style would lend itself to support 4 more books or 3 more books. I don't necessarily know. So this is a tough review to do. And if I'm coming across overtly negative, I don't mean to be. On a scale of like mixed, mostly positive, positive, very positive, and overwhelmingly positive, and then all of that inverse for or reverse for negative scale, I would say this book is a mostly positive. And the reason why it is not mixed is because I did continue with book 2 relatively quickly because I needed to see what was going on. I have to know how this story ends. And that is a positive. And if at the very least, it's not boring, at least to me, it wasn't boring. Some parts of book 2 might have been a little bit boring, but this book 1 was not at all. I had a good time with it. I got through it pretty quickly, and I had a good time. So I hope that I was able to balance the positives and the negatives for this and maybe give you an idea how you would feel about this. I think that if you're looking for a plot-fueled great time, this could be the one for you. I want to thank you so much for checking out this review of The Shadow of What Was Lost. Drop down in the comments and let me know what you think of this. Is this someone you're going to check out? And what other inspirations other than Wheel of Time do you see on this? Because I see quite a few, and I'd love to hear from you. If you like this video, hit like. If you dislike, you can hit dislike. If you loved it, think about subscribing. I'll be doing more book reviews, all the bookish content here on the channel. There's a Patreon in the description. It's optional, but always appreciated. And until I see you next time, be good, be safe, and remember to always keep turning the page. I want to give a big shout out to all my patrons, which include my Wildlings Knights watching Kingsguard. My Kingsguard includes Lauren, Henrik, Kai, Eric B., Oscar Stewart, Stephen R., Kaika, Amanda, RJ Shaw, Nicoletta Tanner, Jennifer, Garrick, Frank C., Evie, Fever J., Sarah, Pat, Prithvi, Kevin, Ryan, Michael, Terrence, Wade, Darren, Taylor D., Derry, John C., Bass, Mitch, Sebastian, Benjamin, Jobot, Noel, Amanda L., Kyle C. Scott, Steve Talks Books, Caitlin S., Dylan M., Yolanda, Carlos, Nicholas, Chadia, Bees Knees, Matthias, and John. Thank you all so much. You're the best.